So this morning, in some angst, I asked Claude, because we'd been dialoguing on this topic for a while, back and forth for about 3 weeks in the same chat, and Claude really had a good sense of this topic that you and I are going to talk about. And I said, Claude, am I projecting too much? Is this wishful thinking, or is this going into sort of a fantasy world? And Claude said, and I quote, "The easy button era is over." The easy button era is over. And what we're talking about right now is a new breakthrough in the AI area that transforms everything. And no, I'm not talking about the next great thing out of one of our major LLMs, or LLMs plus any of the variations on reinforcement learning, or LLMs plus reinforcement learning plus agents, any of the stuff that we've come to know and love. This is different. So what happened fairly recently, a little over a month ago, Denis Ovseyenko, we're going to call him Dennis O. That's what he calls himself. Dennis O., co-founder, chief technical genius of AIX Global Innovations, along with co-founder Denise Holt, CEO. Dennis was doing the legwork in stealth mode for the previous period of time. We don't know exactly how long, but they took the innovation called SeedIQ. It's a trademarked innovation, it's a capability, and they applied it to the ARC-AGI-3 challenge and smashed it. They were right up there at the top with the humans, the best humans on the leaderboard. And there was another company that was doing kind of okay. It was doing like 36%, but nowhere near in the realm of what SeedIQ was doing. So what did the ARC-AGI-3 people do? Well, they changed the game. And in the new game, it got more complex and more devious, and there are more things that could happen. Once again, SeedIQ totally nailed it. Do you think that the ARC-AGI-3 people trumpeted the good news? No. Now, in part, the SeedIQ capabilities are proprietary to AIX Global Innovations, and I'm going to call it AIX. So SeedIQ is proprietary. But still, it should be acknowledged. There should be headlines about this, and so far, the news is, relatively speaking, very, very quiet. But this is a radical change the game completely kind of event, because this is a different kind of intelligence. It's having a little animated thing. You can call it an agent, but it's your animated little object moving around in a physical space doing quasi-physical things and encountering the rewards and dangers of this environment. And there's a variety of games in the whole ARC-AGI-3 challenge. Now, here's what's important. This is why it's so transformative. Dennis O. got this to work while running SeedIQ on a MacBook Pro. Not invoking major data centers, not invoking, the powers of God from on high. It was a MacBook Pro. The radical shift in the amount of compute necessary to pull off this remarkable feat is gobsmacking. Now, here's what we've got to do. This is an instance of scaling. We need to put it into perspective, and what we're going to do is go through, first of all, a series of framing steps that will give you the insight that you need to comprehensively assess what's going on. Secondly, we're going to do a little bit of history. Again, we're doing some context building. And then we're going to show you a few equations. This is not a tutorial. We're not going to do deep derivations. I just need to show you a few things to round out the context a little tiny bit. Now, before we go on, let me just share with you something very briefly. This is an editing interrupt, so to speak. I just got off the phone with Denise Holt, who is CEO of AIX, and she shared the latest on SeedIQ's performance on the ARC-AGI-3 challenge. So I'm showing that to you right here, and also I'll blow up in this next one. And you can see that they've expanded the play of SeedIQ on the ARC-AGI-3 games to 8 of the games. And you can see that they've done 100% on each game, and the levels are maxed out for every single game. So they've done extraordinary performance. I'm providing a link to this leaderboard and other links that Denise gave me in the blog post. So by all means, go to the description box, follow the link to the blog post, follow that to the links to the SeedIQ materials. Overall, though, and I'm going to tell you the punchline at the end. Overall, this is such a big step that we're going to focus on 3 things as a reasonable conclusion out of all of this. And it's not like, oh my God, like, let's revise the corporation overnight. It's going to be, number one, investigate. This is the start of that investigation process. Number two, assess. How big is this? How is it substantive? Is this really? You're going to have to not just take my word, obviously. You're going to have to do some deep diving, dig into this a bit. And then number three, plan. We'll offer some options today, but I'm not going to try to push any alternatives on you right away, because the first steps are to step back, investigate, assess, then come up with a plan. So let's dive in. First of all three methods that we're going to describe broadly, generally today, are all generative. They're all forms of generative AI. The first one, and again, this is to give us context and history and sort of that global bird's eye view before we dive down into any weeds. Now, if you're going to dive into weeds, if you would please go to the blog post associated with this vid, and the way to do it is you go to the description box, link to the blog post. That blog post links to the 2 prior blog posts where I give you all sorts of links to follow down and investigate this to your heart's content. So, right now, we're going to do the high level thing, not the deep dive. And the high level is, what is a generative? And our first instance of generative, actually we're going to start pre-generative, because we need to define in our minds more clearly than ever what it means for an AI system to be generative. That's like the first decision-making thing we've got to say when we come to the design table and say, okay, we're going to solve this problem. So the first thing is pre-generative. Let's take a look at neural networks. The Hopfield neural network was pre-generative. Yes, Hopfield and Hinton got the 2024 Nobel Prize together. Hopfield developed the Hopfield neural network, which was in itself an outgrowth of prior work. William Little contributed. This is back in the mid-1970s. Shunichi Amari, rarely credited as much as he deserves to be. There's predecessor work. But what Hopfield did, he put together a neural network, he ran experiments with it, he reported results, and it was kind of squat. It was like, it's supposed to be an auto-associator. It does that, but not so good on the performance. This is early 1980s, 82 for the Hopfield, and the California scientists were in fairly close proximity. So Hinton, of course, is learning about the Hopfield, and what he introduces, and this is the key thing that identifies a generative system. He introduces the notion of latent variables. Remember, latent variables are what made the backpropagation neural network a breakthrough. Prior to then, it was the Adeline and the Madeline developed by Bernie Widrow. They weren't very effective, just like the Hopfield neural network wasn't that very effective. Introduce latent variables, which is what Werbus did, 1970, was it for his Ph.D. dissertation, Harvard? And then that concept propagated through various channels over to the West Coast, and Hinton introduced latent variables. We often say in the field that he popularized backpropagation, but it was that concept of latent variables that he introduced, and this was his work, into the Hopfield, and lo and behold, we've created a Boltzmann machine. Smolensky suggests removing a number of weights to make it strictly visible to hidden node and vice versa connections, and then all of a sudden you've got a restricted Boltzmann machine, and wow, it's doing good. This is something that works. So introducing the latent variables takes something that kind of works like intellectually interesting but not a practical tool, makes it an effective tool. But there we are. This is the middle of the 1980s. All of a sudden neural networks became a thing. There's DARPA money, there's O&R money, there's interest up and down the board here in this. There's funding and new journals and all kinds of excitement. But the limitations once again surfaced, because you could only do so much with a simple multilayer perceptron, a simple restricted Boltzmann machine. And then we had the neural network winter, during which time, fortunately, Hinton was tenured, and 2002, now remember, we're looking at a time gap from the middle of the 1980s, so 1986-ish, 1985 for I think the restricted Boltzmann machine, and then 1986 everything got a bit more publicized. So in that time frame up through 2002, that's what Hinton needed to come up with contrastive divergence. Contrastive divergence was the breakthrough that enabled deep learning architectures to be built. So it took a little while, just a little bit, after Hinton published that 2002 contrastive divergence paper, for him to get a good graduate student, in this case Ruslan Salakutinov. They worked together. 2006, there's the first deep learning architecture. I think it's appearing in Science. Very short paper, 4 pages. Science has real restrictions. And the capabilities are shown, though. So there's this flurry of excitement in the neural networks community. 2012, they published a much more in-depth, comprehensive, this is how you do it paper. That's the Salakutinov and Hinton 2012 paper. And then it became mainstream. So the time frame, early 1980s for the simple Hopfield neural network, mid-1980s introducing latent variables. You get a workable neural network that does something, but it's limited because it doesn't scale. And it takes really about 20 years, say 1985, 86 to 2006, for the next breakthrough to happen in a way that becomes popularized. 20-year delta. Okay, so put that down for a moment, move on to the next one. Natural language processing. Before we get too much further down the road, let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Alianna Maren. I'm the founder of Themesis Incorporated, founder of the Themesis Academy. I've been an active researcher in artificial intelligence for a long time. Actually, I geared my entire life towards this back when I was an undergraduate student, taking the courses that would get me ready to pursue this field even before the field began. That's a story that we'll reserve for another day. I can tell you that for the past 10 years, I've been fascinated with Friston's notion of active inference. I've been avidly studying it and writing little papers that would help me understand. So that means the YouTubes, the blog posts, the derivation of variational Bayes, which is my tutorial for myself, at 72 pages by now, that explains the notation because I was cross-referencing amongst 3 different sources and it was mind-numbing and maddening. Active inference has been one of my private passions, along with my own research, which we're not going to talk about here, but is also related to creating AGI. So I have been eager for a breakthrough that would move us closer to AGI, and that's why I'm so excited about this conversation that we're having today. So with all of that by way of personal introduction, let's get back to our matrix of how the major evolutions in AI have evolved. We're looking at the pre-latent, the latent, and then the scaling breakthroughs. And this time, we're going to turn our attention to NLP, or natural language processing. Natural language processing. 1972, Karen Spark Jones invents the TF times IDF. That's term frequency times inverse document frequency method, and it's a means of extracting relevant terms out of a document. So if you can take a document, actually a whole set of documents, and identify the key terms in each and their relative strengths in terms of importance to that document and to the entire corpus. It's a whole corpus-wide approach. Then you can say, these are the terms that are most characteristic of given documents. And that gives you the basis for things like clustering, topic mapping, which wasn't introduced until 2002, which was, by the way, a generative method. In terms of getting a vectorization method, that was it until 2013, Mikolov and colleagues out of Google Brain, and they did a method called Word2Vec, also Doc2Vec, which was a generative method for characterizing the terms that are important in a document. Basically, they replaced every term with a vector, and the vector field elements had strengths that represented how important a given word was. So you could, even though your term vector list could be very, very long, it could be much, much shorter than the total number of words available. And if you're Google and you're looking at a very, very large corpus, then this kind of method is very, very important. So you're getting this Word2Vec, Doc2Vec methodology coming out of Google, 2013, and then 2017, you get the Vaswani and colleagues producing the transformer architecture, that attention is all you need. Okay. Right there at 2013, Mikolov and colleagues, that is introducing latent variables. The gap there from introducing latent variables into a pre-2000 algorithm, the TF star IDF, is 2013 to 2017, just 4 years. Now, look, Google has a lot of very, very bright minds. They're working in teams. They're sharing. Everybody's whiteboarding with each other. It is a lot easier to have the cross-pollination of ideas. But only 4 years happened between introducing latent variables and introducing the scaling method. Now, it took a little work, a little bit more time. We didn't get the ChatGPT until it was November 2022, and then successive evolutions every year thereafter, really every few months. So, going from no latent variables to latent variables, that was the first big breakthrough in NLP, and then going from introduction of latent variables to a more scaled up system that could take on huge volumes just by scaling, that was relatively short. These are our two contexts. Now let's take on the third element, the Bayesian. Bayesian, oh my God, Bayesian is old. The notion of probabilities is 1700s. So 1996, Michael Jordan, that's the Michael Jordan of machine learning fame, not the Michael Jordan from basketball. Michael Jordan introduces mean field theory. This is a significant step in introducing latent variable considerations. There were a number of other contributions, a lot of active research there, but that's 1996 for Jordan. 2016, there a paper, it's Variational Inference, a Review for Statisticians. Really a great comprehensive paper. That's 20 years later. And there's all kinds of fabulous research going on. So we're looking at the breakthrough in basic Bayesian, which says we're going to predict an outcome based on these observables, into a system where we're working in the latent space. We are inferring a latent or hidden variable based on our observables, and based on that latent or hidden, we're predicting an outcome. That is a step different. And so there's this 20-year era where latent variables are being introduced, late 1990s to mid-2010s. Early 2010, Friston is actively putting forth his preliminary notions on what he calls active inference, and 2013, 2015, his first two papers sort of looked at in tandem, defined the field of active inference, which is variational inference with two distinct evolutionary steps. One is that it's active, meaning you're not just matching the model to the data once, you keep on matching the model to the data as the data changes. The other step with active inference as compared to variational inference is that you're explicitly identifying a Markov boundary between the internal part of the system, that part where you are constructing a representation based on your model, versus the external surround. And that's a very clear and important distinction. So active inference, it's basically a continuous process of upgrading your model over time. And latent variables are definitely involved. So active inference has been known since, well, obviously a little bit over 12 years now. Not well known, though. It was regarded as, and still has been up to now, regarded as theoretically fascinating, very well justified, possibly of potential importance, but it wasn't scaling. So last month, Dennis O, SeedIQ, busted out the scaling capabilities with active inference. Now, it's more than active inference. Secret sauce abounds. We're not going into it here. Please just go check the blog post and follow the blog post links to the prior blog posts where there's a chunk of technical discussion. We're not going into that right now because we want to do something a little bit higher level still. So here's the thing. We've just seen already two major instances of what happens when you break out of a basic algorithm because you've got scaling. Number one is you take a restricted Boltzmann machine into a deep learning system. Wow, a whole field of neural networks opens up, all kinds of capabilities that we couldn't do earlier because the neural network was just too simplistic. are now possible. The other one is NLP. Word to vec, doc to vec, great. And useful even at a Google scale. That's where they come from. But they weren't giving us the widespread generative capability. You introduce the whole transformer notion, which is a scaled capability, and all of a sudden, we all can use this fabulous new capability, and it's had such widespread application. Active inference has just hit the same tipping point. Now, here's where it takes our attention. We're going to go a little bit deeper now. So let's figure out the impact of this new evolution for us. What we really need to figure out is how much time do we have? For example, there was that whole 20-year delta between the invention of the restricted Boltzmann machine and Hinton's contrast of divergence breakthrough, and then another 4 years before deep learning became created, and then more years before it became popularized. So we were looking 20-year delta from the initial invention of the Boltzmann machine to the conceptual breakthrough, and then the better part of another 10 years for its widespread emergence and widespread adoption. The transformer evolution had a much faster time frame, going from the initial TF-IDF to the word-to-vec, doc-to-vec, invented in 2013 and 2014. There were really just a few years until the invention of transformers and then actual implementation of transformers, seeing, for example, the first instance of the ChatGPT series. That was just a few more years. So that happened rapidly. Now we're looking at active inference conceptually evolved, introducing the latent variables that were needed, say in 2013 to 15, but now the evolutionary step is SeedIQ. It's about 12 years later, and the question now is, how fast will that impact our work and our world? So we're going to take a little historical journey here to get a context. The point here is for you to have enough historical context. And by the way, a significant number of these slides I'm putting into the blog post for this YouTube, pairing up reading the blog post with listening to this YouTube. Find the correlation between the slides that I'm showing you here in this YouTube and the slides that are posted, and then you can also drop down and catch the original references and resources that are available to you. Let's sum up by having a final look at Friston's work in generating active inference, because this is the one area that has not been fully exploited, but is now available as a breakthrough capability. So the reason that conversation with Claude early this morning led to Claude saying the easy button era is over is that active inference is substantially more difficult to understand. Oh, I hate saying that. I really do. I don't want to call things easy or hard, difficult, but the truth is active inference is a substantially more meaty topic. And the reason that we've glossed over this kind of thing up until now is that, first of all, with the generative neural networks, the Hinton stuff. Oh, have you tried to read a Hinton paper? I mean, one of the things that I do in the course that we offer through Themesis, the top 10 terms in statistical mechanics, is we take that first paragraph in the 2012 Salakutsanov and Hinton paper, just the first paragraph, and identify all the key terms. It's a mind-boggling look at terms. It's like, whoa, there's so much here. And it's a convergence of disciplines. Unless you already know the material well, you can't sit down and just read the paper. It's that difficult. So it's really written for an in-crowd, people who've been following them for years and already know the material, and who it's certainly not a tutorial, okay? So one of the things that we do, and that was inspirational for devising this whole course, was just the mind-numbing factor of terminology from multiple disciplines that all needed to be understood before we could even broach reading the papers. That, however, did not keep us from including generative AI at a light, loose overview level in the courses that I've been teaching at Northwestern and that many of you would have gone through in your own studies. So here's the thing. Let's use an analogy. This analogy is going to help us so much because it'll give us a sense for why things are so much more challenging now than they were. Let's envision our whole study of neural networks, AI, everything associated with this, as a metaphorical journey through an Oregon Trail of AI landscape. So we're starting off, Elm Grove, Missouri. We go through prairie grasslands. This is where you have the fairly straightforward, fairly easy to learn concepts, starting off with the backpropagation, Then reinforcement learning is actually a really old concept, 1979, early 80s, where its genesis, and then of course it's evolved over the decades. CNNs, that's LeCun and colleagues, a couple of major evolutions. That's 1980s, late 1980s, early 1990s. And then we start going into what's generative. And let's think of the generative as being significantly higher in altitude. It's like going through the Sierra Nevada mountains after the grasslands. It's much more difficult. It's more rarefied. It's harder to breathe. It's more dangerous. Not everybody survives that passage, okay? But most of us in our studies will sort of take it as sort of like beads on a string, learn backpropeller and CNNs. When it comes to the Sierra Nevadas, it's like we all just get into a plane and do a flyover. And a flyover does not get us intimately familiar with terrain. We get sort of a general view of like, oh yeah, landscape looks pretty rugged down there. But it's not the same as going through. And we need to go through it. But we've been able to gloss over, especially in the courses that are typically offered, because there's enough easy to access code for people to just pull down the code, start pushing in the data, tweaking parameters, number of hidden nodes, number of layers, that sort of thing, and getting results, reporting on it. It's like they don't need to know the details. They don't need to have read a Hinton paper to run the code. LLMs, you've read the Vaswani paper, haven't you? The Vaswani et al., Vaswani and colleagues 2017, Transformers. Attention is all you need. It's a recipe. There's no theory behind it. It's a very straightforward, do this, do that. Hook these things up in a certain way. There's no theory, and actually when you read that, you miss the core fundamentals that make it generative. There's no way that you would read that paper and say, oh yes, of course I see why this is generative in the same way that a Hinton-Boltzmann machine is generative. It doesn't pop out. But it's enormously easy to implement. It's enormously easy, relatively speaking, to keep adding on to that stack, add more and more nodes, more and more, capabilities to bring in tokens and create what you need. LLMs have been our easy button error. And it's over. Even with adding reinforcement learning, even with adding agents, the conceptualization there has been relatively graspable. But if you go to a Friston paper, that's like looking at a Hinton paper, it's not easily graspable. So I'm going to talk very briefly with you about your options, because this is what you need in order to be able to grab onto this field. And the reason why it's important to talk now is that it's going to take a re-envisioning of what we're going to do and different resources. So I'm going to point out just a few resources that are available to you right now. The Active Inference Institute, your home for all things active inference related, dedicated to improving the accessibility, rigor, and applicability of the active inference framework. And I can tell you, as a member of the board of directors of the AII, that they are actively working to provide you with increasing resources that will ensure that your forays into the world of active inference become increasingly more knowledgeable and beneficial for you. They have a huge collection of resources. Created over many years, it's available, it's free. It still needs a bit more sorting into what we'd call courses. It's nobody taking you by the hand and saying, start here. Denise Holt, co-founder of AIX. She's been offering the Learning Lab devoted to active inference for several years now. A lot of materials. And one of her course offerings allows you access to the whole library. I just talked with Denise recently and found that the learning labs are probably best suited for those who are in the business environment, that is, the CXO suite and also investors. So if you are interested in learning about active inference from the point of view of being a business leader or investing in companies that will develop technologies based on this, then the AIX Global Innovations Learning Lab is probably the best place to start. And then through Themesis, we've got YouTube, such as you're watching right now. There's a lot of active inference YouTubes, a lot of active inference blog posts, and there's also supporting materials. There's materials on generative AI and underneath the generative AI StatMech, which we'll get to in just a moment. There are 2 books out, though. I want to share those with you first before we move on. Book number 1, Active Inference. I hope that this is showing up on screen. It's by Parr, Pezzulo, and Friston. Friston was not allowed to write much in this. He's being credited as an author, but Parr and Pezzulo told him, look, we don't understand the way that you write. We're going to write. You're allowed to make comments now and then. And, okay. Now that book, it's a good book. I haven't read it to any depth yet, but it is readable. If you were having a course that lasted like 10 weeks for a quarter, 16 weeks, it'd be very appropriate. And it's not that heavy in terms of the equations. If you're seriously offering a course, or if you're seriously dedicated to self-study, this book right here, Fundamentals of Active Inference. This one is by Sanjeev Namjoshi, and it's only been available for a few months. Publication, 36 pages, small font, really small font, and lots of equations. This is a serious, solid study book. This is a graduate level course. If you're doing a full-fledged AI program where you grab people in at the undergraduate level and you take them through enough math, enough preparatory material, I could see this being offered junior year. I could see it being offered as a combined undergraduate-graduate course in certain programs. But this is serious, solid, steady material. First time that this carefully worked, very meticulous, well-crafted, and I do mean this is a very good book. And if you are suitably motivated, the Active Inference Institute, AII, is offering for free 3 different study groups that are ongoing, that have just begun. And I'm giving this YouTube right now. We're shooting this last day of April in 2026. We've had 2 sessions in the study group so far. If you get a hold of the book, and there are both Kindle versions and hard copy, you can follow along beautifully. You don't need the book to join the study group sessions. They present the important figures. There's a careful facilitation for each session, but you probably do want the book ultimately. So these are the offerings right now, but in terms of having full-fledged curricula courses, this is evolutionary right now. From the Themesis point of view, here's what we're offering. First of all, the important thing, the thing that we all have to wrap our heads around right now, and it's suddenly become much, much more important, is that we need to understand generative as generative, not just generative in the context of a transformer, where we don't really get too deep with the theory there, or generative in the context of a Boltzmann machine, or any of the other generative methods that we know. We need to understand how it is that they all fit together. We also want to understand how is it that something that is a neural network based with specific nodes can be generative, and also this model-based approach where there are no nodes, but that's also generative. We need to understand that if we're going to be proposing generative methods, and the SeedIQ is still indeed generative, active inference is generative, we need to know how all of these relate. We need to get some substance, a little bit of foundation underneath us. And the foundation is simply this. Really simply this. There's 3 key elements to any generative system. First of all, you're going to take a model and adapt the model to your data. So you're finessing the parameters of the model. In a neural network, what you're finessing are the connection weight values. In a variational inference or active inference system, you have a generically undefined model, but you can put in whatever you want. So suppose it's a collection of Gaussians. Then you're fussing with the parameters for the different Gaussians. You're adapting parameters. Here's the important thing. This is what makes it generative versus the prior steps or thinking that was not yet generative. And this is that we introduce latent variables. Every generative system is wrapped around the notion of latent variables. And then what happens is that mathematically adapting the approach of changing, morphing, adapting our model so that it best fits the data, that gets taken into the realm of statistical mechanics. There's some mathematical origami folding that takes us from the original divergence equation into a free energy equation, which is straight out of statistical mechanics. Now, it's worth noting here, this is really important for active inference, especially as you expand active inference with scaling such as was done with SeedIQ, that in active inference, you do not need to have a continuous model. If you're dealing, for example, with LeCun's JEPA joint embedding predictive architecture, then you do have to have continuous models. But in active inference, you don't, and that's why, for example, in SeedIQ, the little agent that was directed towards the goal could move around corners, so to speak. You can use Markov chains here, and you can envision this somewhat like a chessboard, so you can not only move a bishop or rook or queen in a straight line, but you can take a knight and do a jumping, irregular kind of movement. That is possible in active inference. So back to our main theme, which is what makes a system generative. So I found out that the last bit of sound recording had kicked out during recording, and we're going to redo a little bit of that last sequence, this time pulling together what you need, more or less framing things in terms of that investigate, assess, plan, action sequence that we described earlier, but now you've got the context. So let me just share with you briefly, just to get started. Had another conversation with Claude this morning. Let me just read it to you without trusting my memory. Here we go. So Claude is saying, and this is regarding my joking with it sort of, Claude was saying, ending, I'm saying over, and Claude is saying, I've been precise, but you're being accurate to the moment. Keep over. So let's just go with it, shall we? The easy button era is officially over. Here's the important thing with this. This is not just, here's a new AI breakthrough. Okay, we have those happening regularly. It's not just a breakthrough. It's not just, here are new applications opportunities. It's a fundamental reframing. It's a reshifting of how we hold the organizational framework of AI. That's why I showed you that matrix earlier. And let me add just a couple of elements here because we want to make this as complete and comprehensive a organizing mental model as you and I can internally hold, because it tells us how everything fits together. It tells us how the puzzle pieces connect. So first of all, you'll notice that I did not mention any of the early AI methods, the backpropagation. That's actually sort of a level 0. We had 1, 2, 3 being generative neural networks, then transformers, then the new active inference SeedIQ bottom tier. But prior to that, let's call it level 0, that was the breakthrough from no latent variables, that's the early Adeline-Madeline, to the Paul Burbis introduction of latent variables, giving us the backpropagation method. First serious significant breakthrough in AI. It made the whole neural network thing possible. Then, if you were trying to find, well, how did this scale? Because we're looking for that scaling approach as the final evolution, and we can remember that CNNs. Jan LeCun's evolution of CNNs, that's really backpropagation. It's a deep backpropagation approach. So it's like, oh yeah. And the secret sauce is all this special fancy things that you do with CNNs to get them to work. You know, we're talking about dropouts and max pooling and all kinds of little CNN-specific innovations. But yeah, that works, doesn't it? So we're building out our conceptual framework. That's what we need. Second point, we're adding to this framework here. Second point, you'll notice that I didn't mention agents. Well, they weren't part of the earlier games. Agents, though, are implicit, intrinsic, essential to active inference. If you look at the earliest Friston graph, he's showing agents. I'm going to bring that up again here and overlay it. When you see the A for the action, and I believe it's the S for sensing agents, that's part of the earliest conceptual design. That's like 12 years ago. Just recently, we've had the mechanisms to make these agents work effectively, but they've always been part of the thought process. And of course, SeedIQ is very, very, very agent-based. So this is making sense. The framework is filling out here. It's getting more robust. So let's talk about your investigation, your assessment, and your planning in terms of 3 different potential roles that you might have. That would be your power triad of investor, CXO, notably your CEO, but the whole CXO tier, and then your chief, let's call him techno-wizard. I like to call that your chief magician, the person who's going to provide the intellectual complement, if you would, to your CEOs building out the empire. So let's look at the elements for this. Well, it completed the whole video. Each of those 3 different roles, specific recommendations for each of you in those different roles, and YouTube at midnight last night refused to upload that vid. So here we are. I hate to do a cliffhanger with you, but we're cutting this back. This is now part 1, and please look for the continuation in part 2 very shortly. It's been so much fun chatting with you, and I look forward to our next round. Once again, Alianna Maren from Themesis, signing off. Have a lovely day.